Hi, in this module, we're going to talk specifically about voter rights. And we are fortunate to have quite a few videos that you'll see related to voter rights and really explaining in a way that I think is going to be probably more interesting than watching Professor B do a PowerPoint. Let me just briefly go over the history of voter rights. So the right to vote has actually been a historical struggle for civil rights, because it wasn't spelled out initially in the Constitution. So we've actually fought wars for the right to vote and had protests that were almost like wars. So the Civil War and the abolition movement paved the way for constitutional amendments that outlined the right to vote. Why was that? Well, because in the initial Constitution, the right to vote was only granted to a very small number of people, white, male property owners. So in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed as an outcome of the Civil War, which granted African American men the right to vote. But after that, there were years and years and years that still continue today of voter suppression. And so the 15th Amendment was passed as well. And it's explicitly talked about the right to vote for African American men. So it clarified that. And yet voter suppression continues to today. There's a Supreme Court decision then that happened after that that justified this notion of separate but equal. In 1964, poll taxes, which were part of voter suppression, were banned. Women's right to vote was not guaranteed in the Constitution, nor was it granted after the Civil War, even though women fought for it then. So the right to vote for women was not granted until 1920s. So literally 42 years later, women have fought long and hard for their right to vote. Indigenous people, Native Americans, you might think would have had the right to vote because, well, quite frankly, they were here first. And yet full rights of citizenship was not granted until 1924. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is kind of an interesting thing because it was a huge land deal that happened after the Mexican-American War, and it granted the United States, California, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. So we were pretty little before this. All the people who lived in those areas had been Mexicans, and they now were in the United States and had a choice to become citizens of the United States or go to Mexico. Well, most of them decided to stay, and yet there's still dramatic discrimination against people who, quite frankly, were in places like Arizona first. Obviously, that has continued the controversy over the border between Mexico and the United States. In 1965, the Voter Rights Act was passed, and this was a long fought for victory, and the videos included in this module will talk about it. It prohibited discrimination in voting, and it prohibited states from imposing voting laws that resulted in further discrimination. It ended things like literacy tests and poll tax, which are also called Jim Crow laws, and were being implemented primarily to keep African Americans from voting after the Civil War and the 14th and 15th Amendment. And then further, it prohibited certain jurisdictions from changing their voter laws without approval from the United States Attorney General. Arizona was one of those areas covered by that. They were prohibited from changing laws. Well, in 2013, the Supreme Court made a decision called Shelby versus Holder, and we will talk about that in one of the videos as well. But what it did is it struck down parts of the Voter Rights Act, and it allowed states to start passing election laws without federal approval. So in many of those states, we are now seeing things that have happened in the past in terms that lead to voter suppression, such as voter purges being done incorrectly. So you're going to learn more about that in the videos as well. Enjoy this module on voting rights, one of the most important votes, probably the most important right we have as citizens in a democracy.